Imagine waking up to a world where the Cold War was at its height, a world where two superpowers, each with its own ideology and ambitions, seemed locked in a perpetual battle for supremacy. The Soviet Union, once a symbol of hope for the working class and an unyielding force in world politics, seemed like it could last forever. But then, in a shocking turn of events, the USSR collapsed. In just a few years, an empire that once spanned one-sixth of the Earth's landmass disintegrated. Under the Iron Curtain that had once divided nations fell, and with it, a way of life that had been solidified for over 70 years. What went wrong? How did the Soviet Union, a force that had once commanded the world's attention, fall so quickly? The collapse of the USSR didn't happen overnight, and in this story, we're going to explore the causes, the events, and the people who played pivotal roles in its rise and demise. The Soviet Union was a global force. From its early days in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution to its peak as the world's second-largest superpower, the USSR was a beacon of power, influence, and ideology. But by the late 20th century, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. The Soviet system, once a symbol of hope for millions, was crumbling from within. The military, once the proud defenders of socialism, faced economic challenges they couldn't overcome. The people, who had endured decades of harsh policies and secrecy, were growing disillusioned. Understanding what went wrong with the Soviet Union is more than just looking at the collapse of a country. It's about understanding the cost of idealism, the impact of authoritarianism, and the limits of centralized power. And perhaps more importantly, it's a lesson in how great empires, no matter how strong, can be undone by their own flaws. To understand the fall of the Soviet Union, we first need to look at how it rose. It all began in 1917, when the Russian Revolution brought an end to centuries of imperial rule. After the fall of the Romanov dynasty, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, took control and ushered in the first communist state in history. They promised to create a utopia, a society where wealth would be shared, the working class would rule, and the evils of capitalism would be eradicated. Under Lenin, the Soviet Union took its first steps toward becoming a global power. But this new society was far from perfect. Lenin's policies, especially during the Russian Civil War, were harsh, and many people suffered under his regime. Yet, he managed to solidify power by eliminating political rivals and establishing the Soviet state as a military force. After Lenin died in 1924, Joseph Stalin would rise to power, taking the Soviet Union into a new, more brutal phase. Under Stalin, the USSR became a totalitarian state. He centralized power, purged political enemies, and initiated massive industrialization projects that transformed the Soviet economy. These changes came at a terrible human cost. Millions of people died in the forced collectivization of agriculture. And the Great Terror, when Stalin purged anyone he saw as a threat to his rule. Despite the horrific cost, Stalin's efforts succeeded in industrializing the Soviet Union and creating a formidable military power. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two superpowers in the world, rivaling the United States in both influence and military strength. But beneath the surface of this victory, cracks began to form in the foundation of the Soviet state. From the outside, the Soviet Union appeared to be a robust, organized superpower. It had a strong military, a vast territory, and an ideology that seemed to inspire millions around the world. But the reality inside the USSR was far different. The system that Stalin built was one of immense control, with the state having its hands in nearly every aspect of life. The Communist Party was the only political force, and dissent was not tolerated. The economy, while large, was heavily centralized. The state controlled all production, distribution, and planning, which stifled creativity and innovation. And while the Soviet Union boasted impressive industrial achievements, like being the first country to send a human into space, it also struggled with inefficiency, corruption, and a lack of basic consumer goods. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet system had grown stagnant. The leadership, while still holding power, was disconnected from the struggles of the average citizen. But the greatest flaw of the Soviet system was its failure to adapt. As the world changed, the USSR remained rigid in its ideology and structure. While capitalist countries were embracing technological advances and consumer-driven economies, the Soviet Union remained locked in a top-down system that couldn't keep up with the changing times. This stagnation would prove to be its undoing. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing internal and external pressures that could no longer be ignored. The economy was in decline, and the arms race with the United States was draining the USSR's resources. The people were growing restless, and the government's control over society was beginning to fray. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1985, Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, bringing with him a new vision. He introduced two major reforms: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost allowed for greater freedom of speech and expression, which was revolutionary in a country where dissent had been brutally suppressed for decades. Perestroika aimed to reform the economic system, moving away from the rigid central planning that had plagued the economy for years. But while Gorbachev's reforms were necessary, they came at a time when the Soviet Union was already too weak to absorb them. The opening up of political space allowed people to voice their frustrations, and soon, public demonstrations erupted across the country. The call for independence in satellite states grew louder, and Gorbachev's failure to quell these movements made it clear the Soviet Union was losing its grip on power. By 1991, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. The reforms that Gorbachev had implemented had sparked a wave of political and social change, but they had also exposed the deep flaws within the system. The Communist Party was no longer able to maintain control, and the economy was in freefall. In August 1991, a failed coup by hardline communists accelerated the collapse. Gorbachev was briefly imprisoned, and his power was effectively shattered. In the chaos that followed, several republics within the Soviet Union declared independence, and on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The world watched as the superpower that had once threatened global stability vanished, leaving behind a fractured region and millions of people grappling with a new reality. The fall of the Soviet Union wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the end of an ideology. Communism, as it was practiced in the Soviet Union, had failed to deliver on its promises. The system that had promised equality, justice, and prosperity had instead delivered repression, poverty, and stagnation. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't happen by accident. It was the result of decades of mismanagement, rigid ideology, and an inability to adapt to the changing world. The USSR's internal contradictions, between its promises and its reality, between its need for innovation and its centralized control, led to its downfall. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Soviet Union's rise and fall is this: no empire, no system, no ideology can last forever without change. Even the most powerful forces in the world will eventually be undone by their own flaws if they fail to evolve. The Soviet Union's collapse wasn't just the end of an empire. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of all systems, no matter how powerful they may seem. So what do you think? Could the Soviet Union have been saved? Or was its collapse inevitable? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who are curious about the rise and fall of one of history's greatest superpowers. And if you want to dive deeper into the Cold War and the global impact of the USSR's collapse, check out our Empires and Power playlist for more insightful documentaries.